The bell cracked earlier than her knees did, however the lady didn't cry. She simply seemed past her father to the person looking from the street. His fists curling around reins like they were sins he could not talk, but dust hung in the air, like vintage midday pressed hard on the timber plank avenue of Hollow Bend, a town worn thin with the aid of droughts of water, mercy, and men who remembered a way to be mild. The silence that observed each snap of leather base changed into heavier than the sound itself. A shopkeeper swept the same corner of porchwood for the third time, head down, barrel, then ducked. Madeline Carter stood barefoot on the sun-baked dust, yet she held herself like something older, something. Her skin shimmered with sweat, dust. Her lip became cracked, however her eyes, those wild gray things, did not. Jackson Carter's voice rose like a sour hymn. You need to behave like a few __ you get dealt with like one. Ain't no man wanting you presently behind him. An almost empty whiskey bottle waited like a praise. However, his horse had stopped on its own, sensing something within the air. The person turned out to be younger, 24, with a sun-wreathed face and calloused hands gripping worn leather, Ethan Brooks. Regarded frequently for pronouncing little and failing at nearly the whole lot for the reason that his father died. He had not come to city for justice. He had come to sell a package deal of. But there are moments, few and rare, when a person's heart forgets to live. The crowd had all started to drift, however Ethan's voice cut via them, quiet however clean. Jackson turned, sneering. His boots hit dust, solid and constant. He walked across the road with a form of calm that silences dogs. I said, sell her to me. Appears we gotta change. Jackson laughed large and open-mouthed. Ethan dropped a small pouch to the dust. The sound of metallic towards dirt. Madeline's eyes flicked toward it, then returned to Ethan's. Just do not deliver her back. She looked up, no longer with thanks, no longer with wish, but with a quiet. Ethan pulled off his coat, draped it around her shoulders without touching skin. Besides, we pass now, he said genuinely. Jackson snorted and became back to his. Again below their porches and polite smiles. Ethan helped Madeline onto his horse, his fingers mild as a question he did not ask, like a prayer, dry, broken, but leading away. By the time they reached the brink of Hollow Bend, the sun was leaning west. Madeline clung to the horn of the saddle, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. Ethan led the horse on. He didn't study her, not because he was ashamed, but because something in her stillness felt sacred, like a wounded hawk you don't dare touch except it asks. The location was no longer Lot's. He showed her the spare room, left a folded blanket, a tin cup of water, a slice of bread. He stood in the doorway an extended beat before speaking. Madeline failed to respond. She stepped inside, closed the door behind her. Ethan sat on the porch. He failed to light and listened to the wind rattle the bones of his quiet life. One who had been traded like stock and hadn't shed a tear. Inside, Madeline sat on. She stared at the ceiling and whispered her mother's call over and over, as if trying to conjure her back. She trembled, but her face remained nonetheless. Ethan heard it and sooner or later lit the cigarette, the spark briefly illuminating his tired eyes, then a valid, barely a sound, threaded via the room. Then, please do not let him come back. Ethan iced up, ash fell from his hand to the porch ground, and for the first time in years, the silence around him failed to feel like peace. It felt like a warning. By morning, the wind had changed. It no longer scratched like remorse, but moved softer, nearly like a hush between two people who didn't know what to say. Madeline stood on the porch in Ethan's coat, too large for her shoulders, and stared out across the brittle fields where nothing grew without a fight. Her hair clung to the bruises along her neck. Inside, Ethan stood by the stove, shoulders stiff, frying cornbread the antique clock ticked like hadn't stirred once all night. He set the plate at the table, stepped out, and nodded closer to the food. Madeline didn't move. Her hands were crossed under the coat, her eyes remote, not vacant, watchful, measuring him the way a cornered animal might. Ethan didn't approach. He left the door open and walked to the barn, his boots crunching over dry earth. The morning felt wrong in his chest, like carrying the foul gate. Mended a split rail with hands that remembered better times, times when sweat didn't mean survival. Well, home meant more than just the place you came back to alone inside. Madeline, clear water, no dirt, no sip, one small sip, and felt it coat her dry throat like a whisper that said, "You're still here." When Ethan returned, she was gone from the porch. They moved like ghosts around each other the next few days. He repaired tools. She repaired seams. Neither explained why the silence between them felt like the only safe place left in the world. At night, the storm came, no thunder, just wind and dirt slamming into the house like a fistful of nails. Ethan rushed to tie the barn doors. Madeline stood frozen at the window, eyes wide, arms clenched at her sides. She was curled in the corner of the main room, rocking like a woman half her age. Ethan said nothing. He simply knelt beside her and draped a blanket over her shoulders. His hand lingered, then withdrew, for the first time since he took her from the dust, and for a moment, she wasn't afraid. He stood slowly, rubbed the back of his. I suppose a man has to be really small to think that. Time passed, but something else shifted too. The next day, Madeline had a tin cup. Ethan nodded once. No thank you passed between them. But she stayed a little longer at the table before withdrawing to the porch. The bruises on her hands hadn't yet faded, however. It wasn't Jackson, just one of the Hollow Bend men, bitter, wrapped in gossip like a second skin. He eyed Madeline like she was cattle. Ethan stepped between them. Rufus, Jackson said, smirking. His voice was flat. This land was cursed long before she came. Madeline did not speak. She simply walked back. That night, Ethan found a scrap of parchment he read it twice, then folded it carefully, tucked it in his jacket pocket, like something rare, blistered with stars. Madeline sat at the porch, arms wrapped around her knees. Ethan did not. I didn't want a note. To a long pause. Kissed without pain, she said, barely louder than a breath. Then the way the moon lit her face, bruises softening to memory. He moved closer. Didn't speak, but he took off his hat, positioned it over his chest, and gave her the kind of silence that listens. Inside, the wind tapped once on the window, then left them alone. In the distance, a rider paused at the ridge, watching the house, a bottle glinting at his side. The past no longer quite. The soil around Ethan's ranch didn't give easily. It cracked like old, naked knees pressed to dirt, arms digging. She had brought out scraps of herbs salvaged from the saddlebag he never used, dill, sage, and something she only remembered from her mother's kitchen before Hollow Bend became her world. Now she planted them in silence like prayers no one else had to know. Ethan watched from bitten, but her fingers moved like they still believed something might grow. She didn't know he'd noticed. She saw him leave a folded handkerchief beside the porch steps before dawn so she'd have something clean to wrap her bruises with if needed. Every day was stitched from small things. She swept the porch while no one asked her to, and once, while he passed her inside the narrow hallway, their shoulders brushed. That night, she left a sprig of some things in this life did not want to. The town, however, found ways to speak loud without saying a word. Word had spread like spilled. Ethan Brooks sold a broken woman for coin, let her rot on his land. The preacher's wife left a Bible at the edge of his property line like a warning. Madeline saw it first, did not touch it, just looked at him and said, "You want me gone?" Ethan, tightening the straps on. I did not ask what I wanted. Dirt on his palms, jaw tight. The mint leaves beside the door fluttered like small green flags. That night, Ethan sat on the porch with his. Madeline joined him, hands crossed against the cooling dark. They said nothing. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was ready. Formed like something that, softly, eyes on the moon, she did not have time or money or she smiled. The smallest flicker like a, maybe they weren't looking close enough, and pulled out the folded parchment she'd written on days before. Still carried it, still creased like something sacred. You believe everything people say? He asked. He wanted to ask what Jackson had said with his. What still ached, but some pain doesn't want to be unearthed. And she. The next morning he saw her stitching one of his shirts by the window. "You know red does not fit," he said, half smiling. Outside, a rider passed. Ethan caught the silhouette through the barn slats. Bottle shone in the morning sun. Ethan did not move, but his jaw set firm. That week, they shared a breakfast for the first time at the same table. She buttered his bread, she said, brushing flour from her sleeve. "There's life beneath the porch, but I need the smell of his fingers off." He did not ask whose. That night, the wind rose again. Madeline stepped outside barefoot, feeling the dirt with her soles. She crouched near the herbs. The dill refused to sprout. She pressed her palm to the soil, eyes, lastly, whispering something too gentle for the wind to carry. Ethan approached with 2 mugs in hand. He paused when he saw her hand resting lightly on earth, like she was asking, "You ever talk to the dirt?" He asked time. She answered. This time, she did not pull away. "I cannot promise anything," he said quietly. "Not safety, not clean, not even that you will need to live." She looked up at him, eyes. "I did not need a promise," she said. She did not pull back while she was filthy, once sharp and distant from the path of Hollow Bend. Neither moved, but in her eyes, she knew that sound, and who might be following it. The morning came, mean, wine gnawed through the eaves, and the fence, already weary, gave up one of its rails. Ethan stood, ankle deep in churned dust and splintered timber. Something about the storm last night had changed the texture of the land. It wasn't just the damage, the kind that comes before something worse. Madeline came out barefoot, her braid loose, hands smudged with flour. She did not ask permission. Her hands blistered quickly, but she did not whine. She just braced and pressed and moved while he did. "You don't need help," Ethan said finally, his voice low. "Of being something people do matters too," she replied, wiping sweat from her forehead with her sleeve. "I want to do something with a person, even if it's fixing fences." He looked at her then, not just at the curve of her jaw or the quiet grit in her knuckles, but at the strange strength she carried, like a flame cupped in cold hands, fragile but determined to stay. Inside, they sat side by side in the grass. Dirt streaked across their hands. Breathing was shallow, but even her eyes scanned the land like she didn't quite believe it. "City?" Ethan asked. Madeline nodded. Jackson would not like being embarrassed, especially not by someone younger than him. Ethan's jaw twitched. The horizon had the texture of something watching back. Later, Madeline stood at the wash basin, scrubbing Ethan's shirt with steady rhythm. The red-threaded men stood out like a wound on white fabric. She caught her own reflection in the water, lips pale, eyes ringed with shadows, and did not look away. Ethan watched from the doorway. "You don't have to be strong all the time." He stepped in slowly, a cloth in his hand. That night, they sat on the porch again. The kind of nightfall that made the world feel gentle, even if only for a breath. Madeline rested her chin on her knees, watching the goats chew. "Hollow Bend," Ethan said. "Now I stay because you are." Madeline and Ethan went inside the hills. She lit the lantern. Ethan unlatched the windows too. It was the rhythm of people who had started to trust each other with silence until a rock shattered the glass beside Madeline's hand. She yelped, ducking instinctively, eyes wide with old fear. Ethan rushed to the window, rifle in hand, but saw only shadows on the ridge. No rider this time, just a message. Ethan lowered the next morning, Ethan spent hours placing new nails, new rails, marking his land as if it were a promise. Madeline brought him water, her eyes scanning the horizon every little while. "I want to do something for you," she said, stepping closer. "Not because I feel safe here, but because I want you." Her arm ached, but they ate like they had earned it. He stopped her hand just for a second. Their eyes met. "Then I want to be seen every day." Ethan sat on the porch, rifle by his side. The stars blinked down like Jackson was closer than he'd ever. A coyote howled once, far off and hollow. Just before the night went dark, Ethan did not move. He sat at the porch with his rifle resting against his knee, boots flat to the ground, eyes scanning the edge of the woods like he'd been waiting his whole life for this. The stars above were thin and cruel, like somewhere behind him. Madeline stirred in her room. It was the kind of quiet that comes right before thunder. He stood and stepped off the porch, moving without sound, like someone who knew the weight of every creak in the timber boots. As he walked toward the fence, he simply waited, and the dark responded. Jackson emerged like a stain, bottle in one hand, a pistol in the other. He peeled off after the last time Ethan stared him down, torn at the collar, his eyes bleary, his walk volatile but mean. "You got her like livestock, but she's still Carter. You can't rewrite that with some fancy fence." Ethan said nothing, hand never leaving the rifle. Jackson's grin turned bitter. "Easy just cause you cleaned her up and gave her a bed." Ethan's voice was steady. "That landed." Jackson stepped. Jackson raised the pistol. The sound of Ethan's rifle cocking echoed across the field. The sound was clean. "If you shoot," Ethan said, "one of you dies." A pause, a shifting of breath, and then a door creaked open. Madeline stepped into the moonlight, barefoot, hair down in the same tattered dress she wore the day Ethan found her. She walked past Ethan, slow, deliberate. He did not stop her. Jackson said nothing. "You want to hit me again," she said, voice cutting through the night like a blade. "Go on, try." Jackson flinched like, "Listen then, so now you'll listen to this." She stepped closer. He still didn't move, but he gave her silence. Jackson's hand exploded open like a dropped bottle. The pistol hit the ground. He staggered back, clutching the wound, eyes wild. Ethan lowered the rifle, breath held like a prayer. Madeline didn't move. She simply watched as Jackson fell to his knees, gasping, bleeding, whimpering like a child who didn't understand why the world didn't bend to him anymore. "You never get to lift your hand to me again," she said. "No one from Hollow Bend did." And in the quiet that followed, even the trees seemed to draw a breath and hold it. Ethan picked up the pistol, unloaded it, and tossed it into the dust beside the man who had once owned her name. "You may not get a second warning." Jackson staggered to his feet, eyes dark with a mix of hatred and humiliation. He turned, bleeding and limping, into the dark, his pride leaking behind him like blood on dust. The porch light glowed. Madeline exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to shake the air around her. She turned to Ethan. He shook his head. "Your horse, you did that." She stepped closer. "No, I survived, but you." She reached for his hand, the one still. They stood like that for a while, the wind brushing past them like it was trying to memorize the moment. It smelled of sage and soap. On the porch, in the hush between them, Ethan whispered, "You ain't what happened to you." Madeline smiled, eyes last. Ethan and Madeline did not speak of marriage. She stayed, not because she had nowhere else, but because she chose the place where no one asked her to kneel. She was covered with scraps of old cloth where she kept the first coin he had brought to her father's feet, not as it offered her, but as it had ended something. On Sunday, she stood outside the house Ethan had found in a drawer. He joined her, shirt clean, eyes brighter than they had been in years. "We make new things," he said, "and while people ask who I am," he took her hand, gentle as sunrise. "Tell him you are the woman who walked through fire and stayed." She left soft prints in the dirt. They were made by the quiet, steady hands that held her when no one else did. They simply loved.